to consider the life of one of the most amazing women who ever has graced the pages of the scriptural record. It's our privilege to study Hannah. Hannah would reveal in her life the highest of godly principles and an example of victory through sacrifice that would inspire Mary, the mother of Messiah himself. In these studies, we will discern the spirit of this amazing woman, a passion for the truth that set her apart from others, a disposition to prayer that brought her close to God, an ability to set the heart of her children alight, and a powerful sense of purpose which directed her life. So says the introductory note in the beginning of our handbook, and we hope, brothers and sisters, in the course of our studies to discover all of those things and to find them to be wholly and absolutely true. Perhaps just a word before we begin, and that's this. This is a story. It's the story of a person's life, and you'll know that every story's got chapters, and that as each chapter is added to the story, other threads tie together, other parts of the story emerge, which make you more convinced about earlier chapters. And I'm going to ask you to treat this story in such a way that as we move through the story of her life, chapter by chapter, you allow the story to unfold itself and to find confirmation that what we've begun with turns out to be absolutely true as the story itself proceeds. Now, some of you will know, and you don't need to turn it up, but you will know that the last few chapters of the book of Judges, which are considered to be the appendices, chapters 17 to 21, that there is good reason chronologically to believe that those appendices, although at the end of the book, belong at the start of the book of Judges in terms of their setting. And so we believe is the case. But what that also means is that the last actual event, the last actual episode in the book of Judges, before we shall come across Hannah, is the story recorded in these words, where it says in Judges 13, "And there was a certain man of Zorah, of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and bare not." And so the last story of the book of Judges will be about a faithful man and his barren wife. A certain man of Zorah, Judges 13, verse 2. And the 1st of Samuel, chapter 1, verse 1 will say, "Now there was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim, and he will be married to a woman who has no children," says verse 2. And we realize that Judges is going to flow straight through into the 1st of Samuel and the story of one certain man and of the barren woman that was his wife. But the two stories for all of that will be remarkably different. So come to the 1st of Samuel, chapter 1, verse 1, and let's take up the record now of what will be the beginning of Hannah's life experience. "There was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of Mount Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah," says the record. Ramathaim Zophim. Now, of course, we know that later on, that same place, that same town, will simply be called Ramah. 1st of Samuel, chapter 1, verse 19, they went back to Ramah. Chapter 2, verse 11, they went home to Ramah. So the Ramathaim Zophim of chapter 1, verse 1 here is the Ramah, probably the Ramah of Benjamin of Joshua 18, verse 25. And we're told here in this first verse that Elkanah's family had lived in this place for, well, generations, because it says, does it not, he was the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zaph or Zuph. And if you hold your hand in the 1st of Samuel chapter 1 and come to the 1st of Chronicles chapter 6, we have some information concerning this household, this famous household that Elkanah belongs to. Because this is what the record says in the 1st of Chronicles chapter 6 and reading from verse 33. And there it says, "These are they that waited with their children of the sons of the Kohathites, Heman the singer, the son of Joel, the son of Samuel, the son of Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Eliel, the son of Toah, the son of Zuph." So there it is, it's the same household. And if we come to the end of that lineage, we're told in verse 37, the son of Tahath, the son of Asir, the son of Ebiasaph, the son of Korah, the son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, the son of Israel. So Zuph, verse 35, was of the line of Kohath through Korah. But do you notice what the margin says? The margin calls him Zophai and correctly refers us back to verse 26, where he's also called Zophai. And that's the more likely derivation of the name of the city, because Ramathaim Zophim means the twin heights of the Zophites, and it takes its name, the city takes its name from this ancestor of Elkanah. Now, Zuph, he must have migrated from one of the main Kohathite cities in Ephraim, because later on in this same chapter in Chronicles, in chapter 6, verses 66 to 69, we will be told that in the tribe of Ephraim, the Kohathites were granted Shechem and Gezer and Jokmeam and Beth-horon and Ajalon and Gath-rimmon, but Zuph is not in any of those. He's gone. Now, the question is, why do you think he left? Well, we're not told, but one of the possible explanations is that he wanted to establish a new centre for the teaching of the law. He was a teaching priest. He was a Levite. That was their job. And he wanted to extend that work in some other place. And if that was true, then he chose a good situation in going to Ramah for two reasons. Because firstly, Ramah was close enough for regular pilgrimage to Shiloh, where the tabernacle was. But secondly, the place he chose, Ramah, was almost equidistant between those other cities which were already Kohathite cities in Ephraim. He didn't encroach on any of those existing towns. He found a place right dead in the middle of them all. And there he established another centre that the truth might be spread abroad. And you know, I think his zeal as a teaching priest reached beyond Ramah, because we're told in another place that not only was the city called Ramathaim Zophim, but the surrounding area was called the land of Zuph. So says 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 5. So his fame was in the whole region. Oh yes, he was a teaching priest indeed. And that continuing Levite influence must have been there down through time. Because when we come to the gospel records and to the time of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Ramathaim of the 1 Samuel chapter 1 is the Arimathea of Luke chapter 23, verse 51, of which it says that it was a city of the Jews. But that phrase in Luke is a reference to its priestly status. And Joseph lived there, being a priestly member of the Sanhedrin. Oh yes, Ramathaim was going to have considerable history in the record of the Bible story. And this is where Elkanah's family are living. They're living in a city that's been named after his ancestor. Now, the interesting thing about the Kohathites was that they were responsible for the matters of the sanctuary. They were committed to the guardianship of Yahweh's place and Yahweh's ark. And this was the spiritual legacy that this boy had grown up into. Elkanah had grown up in a family that had already been focused on those things for many generations. In fact, Elkanah probably belonged to the most prominent and influential family in the region, as far as the Levites were concerned. Both the town and the territory bore the family name. Or just one more thing before we leave Chronicles. Actually, Elkanah himself, his name is common in this record. You see verse 34 of 1 Chronicles 6, the son of Elkanah, verse 35, the son of Elkanah, verse 36, the son of Elkanah. His own name was famous in this very Levitical family. So when we come back to the 1 Samuel now, and chapter 1, the 1 Samuel chapter 1, what we're given to understand as this record opens with this little genealogy when it says, his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, that he was a man of great significance in this place. There was some history behind him and behind his family. And yet what's interesting, so very, very interesting, is that those details, all of them, will serve as an introduction to the real heroine of the story. Because the 1 Samuel, chapters 1 and 2, will focus not on Elkanah, but on Hannah. Good man though he was, good husband though he was, this will not be his story. This was Hannah's story. And as these two chapters unfold, that will become more and more plain to our view. And what will become plain is that this woman, well, she was outstanding in the nation. In fact, in terms of the relationship she had with her God, she was in a category all of her own. I'm not certain, brothers and sisters, that there was anyone quite like her at this moment of time in the history of the nation. Do you know, in these two chapters, 1 Samuel, chapters 1 and 2, there are approximately 20 references to Elkanah. But there's 80 references to Hannah. 4 times as many as her husband. This is her story. As she will appear before us in the very next verse, as the 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 2 goes on to say, and this man, Elkanah, well, he had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah. Now, it's likely that Elkanah, because he was a Levite and a faithful one, would probably have married a girl within his tribe. After all, that was the rule. Numbers 36 verse 7, they were asked to marry in their tribes, to stay together in that family tribe. And Elkanah, being a good Levite, would probably have done the same thing. So Hannah was probably from a Levitical family herself. But as the record unfolds, we will be impressed more importantly with the idea that whatever her actual genealogy was, she was a Levite in spirit, and she was a Kohathite in fervour. Because you see, what Elkanah stood related to in principle, Hannah felt bound to in practice. Or she would never minister at the sanctuary as a temple servant, but the temple was where her heart was. Her vow of dedication was uttered at the temple. Her child of promise was given at the temple. Her song of thanksgiving was offered at the temple. Her stand for purity was taken at the temple. Being involved with the temple was where Hannah's calling was. Or the name of the other, says verse 2, was Peninnah. Now, but in the Hebrew it says the name of the second. That's a correct translation. And so I think that what that expression tells us is that Hannah was Elkanah's first wife. But the word second perhaps reveals not only the order of the marriages, but the reason for them, because Hannah may have consented for Elkanah to take another wife to raise up godly seed in his family line, because she was barren, you see. She was the first wife, but she was barren, and Elkanah needed sons. And there was a reason why he needed them, because the raising of seed in the family line, as we know, stood related to the preserving of the family inheritance. And that applied even to Levitical families. In the law of the Jubilee return, in Leviticus 25, verses 32 to 34, we're told that even Levites had the right after the Jubilee to come back to their own family lands, their own family property. Numbers 35, verses 1 to 5, talks about that which was allocated to the Levites. You see, although they were Levites and had no formal inheritance of a particular territory, they had allotted portions inside the other tribes. And within those, they had cities and suburbs and houses and fields and flocks. So even Elkanah, the Kohathite, had an inheritance which needed to be preserved and passed on. He needed sons. You know, to be barren in that age was to experience the reproach of others. In a society where the fruit of the womb was counted as a blessing, it was a difficult matter to be barren. Genesis 30 verse 23 says, and Rachel conceived and bare a son and said, God hath taken away my reproach. Elizabeth in Luke 1:25 says, Elizabeth conceived saying, thus hath the Lord dealt with me in the days wherein he looked on me to take away my reproach among men. You see, that's how they felt. And no doubt there were many women in Israel who would have fully sympathized with Hannah's condition. They saw in her grief the understandable, perfectly understandable feelings of sorrow which every barren woman in Israel felt. In an age where the blessing of children was the very mark of motherhood, they knew how the absence of such a child must have wounded the heart. But what they could not see was that the sorrow of this woman involved a level of anguish beyond their comprehension. Because Hannah's wish for a child lay beyond the yearning of maternal instinct. She desired a child that would serve God's purpose and not her own. And because her mind was focused on higher things, she felt her own barrenness more keenly than others could ever know. But her grief at this moment, in this story, was a private sorrow that she carried deep within her. And so verse 3 says, this man went up out of his city yearly to worship. He went up out of his city yearly. Now, that verse, incidentally, is going to set the theme for Hannah's story. You might not think that at the moment, but I can assure you this is the key. Chapter 1, verse 3. It's going to set the theme for Hannah's story because it's going to help us to understand the reason for her grief and the basis for her vow. And the first thing we will be told about her and him is that in an age of spiritual apostasy, when the nation had forgotten mostly what true worship was about, this couple and this family were absolutely consistent in their pattern of worship. The record says they went how often? They went yearly, but as the margin says, they went from year to year. It was a yearly and annual cycle of this family in their faithfulness. In fact, over the page in chapter 2, verse 19, just see these words. Moreover, his mother made him a little coat and brought it to him from year to year when she came up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. When she came up, there's a key. Because you see, as this story unfolds, what we will become more and more convinced of is that Hannah's influence was quite possibly the key reason why they went. She wanted to draw near to the Father. She wanted to worship God in spirit and truth. She yearned for the joy of finding fellowship with Yahweh at the place of his sanctuary. She was the driving force for this annual journey to the temple. And for her, it truly was an ascent, a going up, with all the spiritual overtones that word implied. And where did they go? Why did they go? Verse 3 says they went to sacrifice unto Yahweh of hosts. And every year, of course, the ritual of the offerings that they offered would be the same. First, the sin offering, that confession of sin might be made as the prerequisite for all mercy which might follow. Then the burnt offering, that a fresh vow of dedication might be made to serve Yahweh with all the heart and mind and strength. And then finally, the peace offering, that the offerer might know the joy of fellowship with their God. And the word sacrifice here, zibak, found in verse 3, of course, relates to the last of those offerings, because the peace offering was the climax of the worship. And that's what Hannah had come for. This is what she wanted. She came to find fellowship with her God and to eat a thanksgiving offering with him. And where did they go to do this? Well, says the record, they went to Shiloh. Now, why Shiloh? Well, because of Joshua 18, verse 1. The whole congregation of the children of Israel assembled together at Shiloh and set up the tabernacle of the congregation there. So Elkanah and his family travelled to Shiloh because in the days of Joshua and throughout the era of the judges, the tabernacle and the ark and the altar had all been established in that place. To Shiloh they must go, and so they did. But verse 3 says, and now we have the first ominous foreshadowings of what the whole of the controversy of Hannah's life will be about. But the sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priests of Yahweh, were there. Do you know that the emphasis in that phrase is not so much that Hophni and Phinehas were simply there at the tabernacle, but that they were in control? You see, Eli was too old to manage the physical demands of the priesthood, and so his sons had now taken over. Rotherham says, and there the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests to Yahweh. So they were not just present, brothers and sisters, they were in charge. So the record would have us to know. And their very names were indicative of their attitudes, because Hophni, from Hophni, a pugilist, is from the root word speaking of a fist. And Phinehas, Pinchas, from pay the mouth, and either Nachash, a serpent, or Nikash, a piece of brass. So Hophni was the man of the clenched fist who was aggressive in his deeds, and Phinehas was the man of the brazen mouth who was arrogant in his words. And here at the sanctuary of God were two men who debased the role of the priesthood, who defiled the principle of holiness, who destroyed the joy of fellowship with God. Hophni and Phinehas disgraced the place of worship. They lived scandalous lives in Shiloh in contempt of both God and the nation. And when Hannah came to find fellowship with God in that place, why, the centre of iniquity in the land was at the sanctuary itself. The very centre of iniquity in the land was at the sanctuary. And her contact with these two sent her away determined to seek Yahweh's power upon her to break the cycle of the day when every man did that which was right in his own eyes, because this was her experience with these men every year for year after year after year. That's how deeply it affected her. But you see, all of this was Hannah's thought, not Elkanah's. He was a good man. He was a loving husband. He was a godly Levite. But he lacked Hannah's breadth of vision and intensity of purpose. She wanted a strong deliverer to redeem the nation from the yoke of this bondage to evil. She wanted a faithful priest who could restore the nation to fellowship with God. And she dared to dream of a son who could be both. If she could but be Yahweh's instrument to that end. Because after all, think about it, what could she do? She was one woman in Israel, insignificant, invisible. How could she overcome the evil of Hophni and Phinehas? And the answer is she couldn't. But if God could use her, if God might direct her, then the task might be accomplished. And so when this one woman in her passion and purity met these two men in their evil and corruption, they were set on a collision course concerning the purpose of God with his people. And it was Hannah who would set that contest in motion. This would be her controversy. And Yahweh, through his handmaid, would work a wondrous work indeed. But it all came about because of her expansiveness of thinking on higher things. And so verse 4 says, when the time was that Elkanah offered, he gave to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and her daughters portions. And again, the word offered here, zabak, relates to the peace offering, to the portions of that offering that were going to be shared so that each member of the family had somewhat to eat at the sacrificial meal. And because Elkanah was a just man in all his dealings, he was scrupulously fair in distributing those portions of the peace offering. He made sure that all the members of the family would be given their share. So Peninnah and all her children, each one received their portion, a part of his household. So he made provision for them. But can you imagine the sight of all those children clustered around their mother, all with their portions? It only emphasized Hannah's solitary state. How could it do anything else? And I think that Elkanah was well aware of that, as I'm sure you are. Elkanah totally understood that. So he sought to compensate for Hannah's lack by providing a token of his love. So you see what the record says in the next verse. It says that because of that sense of what Hannah lacked and of Hannah's grief at the time, it says this in verse 5, but unto Hannah he gave a worthy portion, says the record. And the margin says a double portion. But we need to be careful because that's not the same word used concerning the double portion in Deuteronomy 21 verse 17. And this action of Elkanah on this occasion is not related to the rights of the firstborn. It's a different word, a very different word in the Hebrew. In fact, in the Hebrew, the expression is mana akathapayim, which literally means he gave her a portion for two faces. The face being symbolic of the person. And I think what Elkanah was doing, what Elkanah was saying to Hannah when he gave her that portion for two faces was, you know, Hannah, you are as dear and as special to me as if you had borne a son. And so he gave her a portion for herself and a portion for the son he knew she wanted and would have loved but had not borne. And he did that because he loved her. And the record says, verse 6, and her adversary also provoked her sore for to make her fret. Now, it's been suggested that the adversary here is a reference to Peninnah, and that since she had children and Hannah did not, that she became Hannah's adversary in seeking to supplant her. She could certainly take advantage of the fact that although she was the second wife, she had a whole cluster of children, and there must have been many circumstances in the course of daily life where Peninnah no doubt could have made things difficult or painful for Hannah. Hannah was the first wife, but she was barren. Peninnah was fruitful, but she was the second wife. It must have been a very difficult situation for both women to be in, and no doubt there were tensions in this household because of one man and two wives. But the question here isn't whether Peninnah caused difficulties for Hannah, but whether she was the real source of Hannah's adversity described here in the 6th verse. And I use that term deliberately because there is a question about this word. You see, the word adversary here is not the word Satan, which certainly would be translated an adversary. But that's not the word here. The word here is the Hebrew word Sarah, T-S-A-R-A-H, and Sarah is never, ever translated adversary anywhere else. On every other occasion, out of 73 times, it's translated by words such as trouble, distress, affliction, anguish, adversity. Hannah had an adversity. But rendering the term as adversary in this place alone, immediately personalizes the word to an individual, and that's not its proper meaning. It's a word that reflects a condition, not a person. And the words trouble or distress or affliction all express the condition, the underlying condition of the person. And it was the condition that came upon Hannah, which is described here as her adversity. So Young's literal translates, and her adversity hath also provoked her greatly, so as to make her tremble, for Yahweh had shut up her womb. So the word is not so much about an adversary as it is about an adversity. The theological word book of the Old Testament says of this Hebrew word Sarah, it denotes the personal anguish that one encounters in adverse circumstances. And that's a pretty good definition of the Hebrew word. So Hannah had an adversity, but it wasn't embodied in the form of a rival woman. It lay in something larger, something deeper, and something infinitely more painful than anything that Peninnah might have done to increase Hannah's sorrow. In fact, you see what the record says? Verse 6, read again, because it's significant to our understanding of its meaning. It says that her adversity provoked her sore. Now you see that word provoked her sore. In the Hebrew, it's kak. It's the same Hebrew word doubled for emphasis. But that word means to be angry, to be vexed, to be indignant. But here's the thing. In every previous occurrence of this word, before the 1st of Samuel, chapter 1, verse 6, it refers to God being grieved by rebellion or sin in Israel. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 25, chapter 9, verse 18, chapter 31, verse 29, chapter 32, verse 16, chapter 32, verse 21, twice, Judges chapter 2, verse 12. It refers to God's anger at the rebellion of his people. That's what Hannah was upset about. She felt God's anger. She felt how God felt at his people's unfaithfulness. And that was the reason for her deep vexation, that she shared the spirit of her God, and she felt his righteous indignation at the evil within his sanctuary. In fact, you see the word fret there, it provoked her to make her fret. That word fret means to thunder, and almost every time it's used, it relates to God thundering in judgment upon his people for their wickedness. Hannah felt the same as her God. But that indignation she felt, that anger she felt, that distress she felt, that provocation, that wasn't all provoked by Peninnah, brothers and sisters. She was moved to indignation by the evil of Hophni and Phinehas at the sanctuary. That's what broke her heart. That's what challenged her to the matter of this controversy. Whatever Peninnah might have done or not done, it was only incidental to where Hannah's mind was. Hannah's mind was far above those circumstances. In fact, notice the juxtaposition of the words. You see at the end of verse 6, maybe verse 5. Verse 5, Yahweh had shut up her womb. Her adversity provoked her sore because Yahweh had shut up her womb. So on either side of the reference to her adversity came the statement that Yahweh had shut up her womb. And so he had. This wasn't just a barren woman that couldn't bear. We're told that God had closed her womb. And for Hannah, that barrenness was a perpetual reminder of her sore travail. Her need for a son was because of the nation's need for a priest. And the fact that she could not bear that child was an adversity so sore that it brought her to grief. And part of the lesson of this story is that what she construed as the pain of delay, God considered to be the wisdom of sequence and timing. God would open her womb, but not until her petition was coincident with his purpose. Even now, had she known it, God was at work to arrange the convergence of circumstance and people that were needed for the accomplishment of his plan. And the thing was, Hannah didn't know any of that. Not now, not at this stage. And neither do we, brothers and sisters. We don't know what God's arrangements are. But we must learn, like Hannah, that his timing will be perfect in the end. And so verse 7 goes on to say, and as he did so year by year, when she went up to the house of Yahweh, so she provoked her, therefore she wept and did not eat. Even in the Hebrew, by the way, the pronouns are disjointed in the text. But what we do know is this, and this verse is crucial to our understanding, I suggest, of what truly Hannah's adversity was all about. Because what we're told in verse 7 is that this difficulty which afflicted Hannah, which provoked her sore, happened where and when? Every year at the sanctuary in Shiloh. And that circumstance, I suggest, is crucial to our understanding of what the story was all about. Now think about it, brothers and sisters. Just think about it for a moment in terms of what we've just been told. If Peninnah was Hannah's adversary, then what we're being asked to believe is that every year when the family went to Shiloh, two things happened. Elkanah gave Hannah a portion for two faces, And then Peninnah taunted Hannah at the fellowship meal. But if this happened every year, why would Elkanah permit Peninnah to continue goading Hannah right there in front of him? Why would Elkanah not put a stop to that immediately, especially given that they were all together as a family to worship before God? What husband loving his wife would stand by and allow her fellowship meal and joy to be destroyed every year? Elkanah might not have had Hannah's depth of feeling for the sanctuary, but he could hardly have been so blind that he never noticed his second wife taunting his first wife at the same table. To suggest that Peninnah at the fellowship meal with Elkanah provoked Hannah until she broke down in tears without Elkanah ever realizing it? It's impossible. And if Peninnah did behave so badly, for Elkanah to then ask Hannah, verse 8, "Why are you crying?" would be to suggest that he was an ignorant and obtuse man. And that's an interpretation that demeans a godly Levite. Of all the times, when you think about it, when Peninnah might have discouraged Hannah, the last time to choose would have been in full view of Elkanah at the sanctuary, when he was out of range, when he was out of view, when he was out of hearing. Well, there might have been such opportunity, but those opportunities were all at home in Ramah. Of all the times when Peninnah might have been a source of pain, this time at Shiloh was most certainly not the moment. And yet the record insists, verse 7, that's when Hannah felt her deepest grief, at the sanctuary, at the yearly visit, not at home in Ramah. Now, why was her anguish worst at the temple? Well, because that's where her fellowship meal with God was eaten. And that's where the full horror of a corrupt priesthood was made evident in the destruction of that fellowship. That's where her grief was centered and why it occurred in that place. Each year at the temple, Elkanah showed his love to Hannah with an extra portion. And every year, her continued barrenness provoked her despair in that place. Because a wicked priesthood remained unchecked, her own fellowship with God was compromised, and she could not resolve that matter. So Young's literal translates verse 7, "And so he doth year by year, from the time of her going up into the house of Yahweh, so it provoketh her, and she weepeth and doth not eat." So at the very time she was supposed to be in harmony with God, she could not eat the fellowship meal. Now, I think you'll find as our story unfolds is that recognizing Hannah's difficulty as her adversity rather than her adversary will greatly enrich our understanding. Her cause for sorrow was not related to Peninnah's behavior, irrespective of whether that behavior had been good or bad. No, her anguish was more than even simply the matter of her barrenness. Her adversity lay in her inability to bear the child that might rescue the nation from the wickedness of Hophni and Phinehas, which was seen at its worst at the sanctuary in Shiloh. And so verse 8 says, "Then said Elkanah, her husband, to her, Hannah, why weepest thou, and why eatest thou not, and why is thy heart grieved?" Now, don't you think, when you think about it, that Elkanah would not have asked those questions if it was obviously a situation brought about by Peninnah? He wouldn't be asking those questions if clearly Peninnah was at fault. The very fact that he asks these questions in verse 8 tells us that Elkanah didn't know. He really didn't know. He knew it was related in some way to her barrenness, but he wasn't quite sure why. And so he says, "Am I not better to thee than 10 sons?" Which almost might sound as if it's sort of, shall we say, an unfortunate expression. But again, I'm not sure that that perhaps Elkanah means quite what we think it means. I don't think he's saying, I'm better than 10 sons, just enjoy me. The word 10, of course, comes from the fact that there's 10 fingers on the hand, and so it's used to symbolize the totality of human possibility. So 10 times, Genesis 31 verse 7, Numbers 14:22, Job 19 verse 3, 10 times is a symbol of all or many. And I think what he's really saying is, he says, look, Hannah, I know you haven't got any sons, but you and I and the love we share, isn't that better than all the sons in the world, the relationship that we have together? It was his endeavor to try and comfort her because he really doesn't know what the source of his grief is. And I think that what that shows us was that Hannah's grief and her vexation of mind were on such a higher plane that neither Elkanah nor Peninnah knew anything about it. This was something deeper within Hannah alone. This was a grief based on a vision of the truth and what was possible that others had not seen. To seek holiness is to know loneliness. Her desire to come into the presence of God in that place was so intense, and her sorrow at the evil of the sanctuary was so deep that no one had any idea where Hannah was in her mind. She saw her own barrenness as symbolic of the nation's spiritual barrenness. She saw her own ruptured fellowship as emblematic of the nation's estrangement from God. And she wanted to bring forth a faithful priest who could restore the nation's fellowship with God. And her deepest grief was that she could not. And it was a grief so strong that it consumed her to her very soul. So what do you do? What do you do, brothers and sisters, when you've got grief of such dimensions? Well, you do what Hannah did. Verse 9. So Hannah rose up after they'd eaten in Shiloh and after they had drunk. Now, the record's not specific in this verse who it was who ate and drank. But on the basis of verse 7, and as we shall see from a later verse also, we believe that the they referred to in verse 9 was everyone else in the family apart from Hannah. Her distress, you see, prevented her from participating, but you notice that she waited until they were finished. She didn't want her spirit to disturb the fellowship meal of others. Despite the pain she felt within, she didn't want to interrupt their own fellowship meal. And so she waits. And instead, after the meal was over and before they left the vicinity of the tabernacle, now Hannah chose to commune with God in private prayer. She went back to the sanctuary, which must have been close by, while the rest of the family remained at their place of pilgrimage. I think she just got up and she probably just said, you go on. I'll just offer a final prayer to God and then return. So she walked alone, but she walked with purpose. And so the verse says, verse 9, that Eli, the priest, sat upon a seat. Now that's interesting when you think about it, because did you notice that he's Eli the priest, not Eli the judge? Now he was a judge. We're told in the 1st of Samuel 4 verse 18, he was an old man and heavy and he judged Israel 40 years. But he's not called a judge here. He's called a priest, because this whole story will be about priesthood. That's what Hannah's controversy is about. And Eli the priest is symbolic of the corruption of the priesthood that's there, not just through Hophni and Phinehas, but through their father who legitimized their bad behavior. So the record says, Eli, the priest, says the record, well, it says he sat upon a seat by the post of the temple. And here was a sign. Here was a sign of a priesthood that was already removing the ancient landmarks. Because you'll know that in Deuteronomy chapter 8 and 10 verse 8, it says that the priests performed their service of public duties before God standing. The only seat in the tabernacle was the mercy seat. Well, that belongs to God, not to man. Well, perhaps Eli had a seat because he was old. After all, he probably was over 80 at the time, and a seat would not be unreasonable. But the word seat here, kicker, out of 135 times it's translated, well, 127 times of those 135 it's translated as throne. You see, Eli had established for himself a seat of honor, a throne of authority from which to make pronouncements, and he sat down in defiance of the role of the priests to stand as they ministered before their God. And, says the record, he sat by a post of the temple of Yahweh. It was next to a doorpost of the temple. Incidentally, when it says the temple here, we know, of course, it was the tabernacle of the congregation. We will be told that in chapter 2, verse 22. But it's called here the palace of Yahweh because it was his dwelling place among men. And when the tabernacle was finally pitched in Shiloh, as Joshua 18 has told us, it seems that they built a porch over the entrance, and it was under that porch, beside one of the posts that held the porch up, that's where Eli sat. So wherever Hannah was when she came to pray, and she was only old enough for Eli to both see her and to speak with her. And the record says, verse 10, and she was in bitterness of soul. You know, it's a truth for all of us, brothers and sisters, that the anguish of sorrow and the ecstasy of joy are so intensely personal that no one else ever quite or fully knows how we feel. And that's even despite the marriage bond. Come and have a look at this, just 2 or 3 passages that illustrate this. In Proverbs 14 and verse 10, it's a reflection on Hannah's situation, you see, as she came to offer her prayer in bitterness of soul. Do you see what Proverbs 14 verse 10 says? It says, the heart knoweth his own bitterness. The margin says, the bitterness of his soul, which was exactly the circumstance of Hannah. And a stranger doth not intermeddle with his joy. But another translation says, each heart knows its own bitterness, and no one else can share its joy. I think that's a good translation. Each heart knows its own bitterness, and no one else can share its joy. And there's a measure of truth in that, brothers and sisters. We're all unique in a certain respect. Come and have a look at the 1st of Corinthians chapter 2, verse 11. The 1st of Corinthians chapter 2, verse 11 has something similar to say, but it's illustrative of the same principle of the fact that we're all made just a little differently in the unique formation of our character and personality. 1st of Corinthians chapter 2, verse 11 says, for what man knoweth the things of a man, save the spirit of man which is in him? Even so the things of God knoweth no man, but the Spirit of God. Now, the Revised Standard Version says, for what person knows a man's thoughts, except the spirit of the man which is in him? Who knows the spirit of your thoughts, really? Who do you think knows the spirit of your thoughts? The answer is, well, probably the most definitely you. And probably no one else to the same excruciating detail that you do. One more passage. Remember that famous prayer of Solomon in the 1st of Kings chapter 8 at the dedication of the temple? And he gave these lovely words, but they're so heart-rendingly true for all of us, brothers and sisters. In the 1st of Kings chapter 8, verses 38 to 39, the record says this. Here's Solomon's prayer concerning our supplications before the deity. So he says, verse 38 of 1 Kings 8, what prayer and supplication soever be made by any man or by all thy people Israel, which shall know every man the plague of his own heart. Another translation says, is aware of the afflictions of his own heart, and spreads forth his hands toward this house. Then hear thou in heaven thy dwelling place, and forgive and do according to give to every man according to his ways, whose heart thou knowest, for thou, even thou only, knowest the hearts of all the children of men. You see what these verses are saying? Proverbs 14, 1 Corinthians 2, 1 Kings chapter 8. No one else really does know how we feel apart from God in the ultimate sense. Even in the marriage bond, there's a truth in this, brothers and sisters, because our deepest emotions are not always possible to communicate to others. Even two people experiencing the same event might feel different things and respond in different ways. There is a sense in which we're utterly unique. And this, in part, is why Elkanah didn't know the depth of Hannah's soul, because she was made a little differently to him. But she felt that bitterness very keenly. Come back to the 1st of Samuel and see what the record says in that verse. Verse 10. She was in bitterness of soul and prayed unto Yahweh and wept sore. You see, there's a lesson here, isn't there? And the lesson is that when there is no one else, we can come to God. And that's what the faithful do. Even in the face of extreme adversity, the faithful maintain their absolute trust in God. The funny thing is, that our trials can either separate us from God or draw us closer to him. And it's we who make the free will choice. God brings us into such situations so that our own weakness and our own inability to solve life's problems is made clear. And our confidence in him is tested. But out of those trials, good can come, provided we respond in faith like Hannah did. The lesson is that God can save us, can save all men and women out of the most difficult of circumstances. But he requires first that we've learnt to trust in him and to surrender to his will. That's where Hannah was being brought to, you see, in this journey. And so she said, verse 11, she vowed a vow, and she said, O Yahweh of hosts, O Yahweh Tsevaoth. Now that's interesting as well, don't you think? Because do you know that no one in Israel had ever addressed God in that way before? She would be the first person in the Bible to use that title. And it's a mark of how unique she was. You see, Hannah had thought deeply about her crisis, and she knew that Yahweh of hosts could answer her problem. So who do you think the hosts were that Hannah had in mind? Well, it was true that God was in control of the hosts of heaven, the hosts of heaven being the angels. But Hannah's thought was more personal as she called upon the God of her people and the God of her tribe. And if Israel were God's hosts in general, then the Levites were God's hosts in particular, were they not? Because they're described as the Saba of Yahweh, T-S-A-B-A, which is where the word Sabaoth comes from. Theirs was the spiritual warfare of the tabernacle. They were Yahweh's army in the tabernacle. And Hannah addressed her vow to Yahweh Sabaoth, in whose warfare the Levites fought. And she pleaded for his assistance for a battle on which she now embarked as a Levite in her own right. O Yahweh of hosts, she says, the call of the Levites to office. That's her call, her prayer. And note this, brothers and sisters, she did not invoke God in the name of Yahweh Tsevaoth in order to win some personal victory in a feud against Peninnah. Hannah would never have demeaned her God by calling upon him in such a special way for such an unseemly cause. The Yahweh of hosts that she called upon fought for Israel and the Levites because their battles were his. And she believed with all her heart that her battle was his also, and that her controversy was the controversy of Yahweh himself. O Yahweh Tsevaoth, she cries. And if her conflict had merely been with Peninnah, she would not have asked for one child. She would have asked for an entire family that might eclipse the several children that Peninnah already had. And even if the presence of Peninnah's children added to Hannah's hurt, her mind was long since fixed on higher things. Her battle was against an evil priesthood, and for that battle she needed just one child. But a female would not be sufficient. A man-child was needed for a priest to be established. And that's what she prayed for. So verse 11 says, she said, O Yahweh Sabaoth, if thou wilt indeed look on the affliction of thy handmaid. And you'll know that term is used 3 times in this verse. Handmaid, or ma, a maid servant. It was a title of humility and of service and of resignation to his will. She's the only woman, incidentally, to address herself directly before God that way. The only woman to so call herself before the deity. She wanted to be Yahweh's instrument for a salvation which she herself could not accomplish. Behold thine handmaid. You see, she'd thought deeply about the problems of the nation and its spiritual condition. And that's something that spiritual men and women do. They think about the issues of ecclesial life and how best they might be remedied. And she knew what the nation needed. One vow wasn't enough to solve its problems, but she understood the limits of what lay within her circle of control, and she asked for God's help to do that. Hannah was not motivated by selfishness. She was moved by love. She was not a woman desperate for a child, but she understood that the nation was desperate for a saviour. And that's why she prayed for what she prayed. And so she says, verse 11, if thou wilt not forget me, if thou wilt remember me and not forget thine handmaid, but I will give unto thine handmaid a man-child, then I will give him to Yahweh all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head. So right from the beginning, Hannah didn't want a child for the sake of having a child. She wanted a man-child to be a teaching priest and a spiritual intercessor and a godly champion to restore the nation's fellowship to God. So she prayed, in effect, I will consecrate him for priesthood, since that's what the nation needs. So take him, O Yahweh, and use him for thy purpose. Now, how remarkable, brothers and sisters. She asked for a son and immediately pledged to give him back. It was an amazing spirit. If all she wanted was a son, why would she vow to make him a Nazarite in separation and a Levite in dedication all the days of his life? Well, because this son was not for her. You know, there were 2 parts, I think, to her pledge. He was going to be a son who'd be given to God forever, beyond the normal limits of Levitical service, and a son who would be devoted as a Nazarite for life beyond the normal scope of Nazarite vows. Now, you don't ask for a son and then promise to give him back to God forever if your focus is simply on yourself. So what was she really promising? Well, I think what she was saying in this verse 11, brothers and sisters, is, in effect, I can't offer a priest, O God, because we're only Levites. But I can offer you a man-child that could be made a priest after the higher order of the Nazarite vow. So make me thine instrument to that end, O Yahweh, I beseech thee. I think that's what she was asking for. You know, when we go through trial, our prayers take us on a journey. And that journey, however long it takes, finally brings our thinking into line with the divine purpose. And I think Hannah had been on that journey. You see, these years of agony had also been years of petition. We know that. She prayed and she prayed and she prayed. But you see, as she prayed, her thoughts would have become more focused on what she could do to confront these men. No doubt when she first asked, when she first prayed, she probably prayed that God would overthrow them somehow, some way. She wasn't sure, but could God deal with it? And as she continued to pray, her intense desire to turn Israel back to God had finally led to the thought in her continued prayers of an idea so daring that it even left Hannah breathless. But she could see no other way. She finally realized that Hophni and Phinehas could only be defeated by being replaced. But a better priest would not come from their line, she was certain of that. No, a new man offering new hope was the only way, but where was such a man to be found? And suddenly, she knew. He would only be found if someone provided him. But the man she had in mind needed to be focused from the very beginning. Only a child dedicated from infancy could achieve the outcome she sought. It was too late to train him up in the way he should go after he arrived at the sanctuary. No, his education must begin from the day of his birth. In fact, she wanted his journey to holiness to begin in her womb. Such was the standard she would set for his life. What Hannah contemplated was a battle where the weapon of warfare would be her beloved son, and she believed with all her heart that only by giving her firstborn could this battle be waged and victory won. Only by offering her son could her people be delivered from the thraldom of sin which bound them. But you see, here's the interesting thing. All of that resided in Hannah's mind before it became real. Her son didn't even exist when she first envisaged his priestly calling. But faith clothed the future with substance. And this woman of faith saw things that were not as yet, as though they already were, and she asked God's help to turn that vision into reality. There was no one else in Israel who thought this way. There was no one else who implored God with such a bold and dramatic plan. There was no one else prepared to pay the price of a firstborn child who, having known the joy of receiving him, would willingly suffer the pain of giving him away in the agony of accomplishment. God so loved the nation that she gave her only begotten Son, that the nation through him might be saved. And in her, the Spirit of our God was seen, a living embodiment of the purpose of Yahweh of hosts. See, this is what it meant to be the handmaid of the highest. And this is why God so delighted to answer the prayers of his handmaid. She wanted to be nothing more, but nothing less than his instrument. And she would accept whatever consequences that pledge might bring upon her. Here was a sister of extraordinary spiritual insight. And here was a woman whose mind was focused, always focused on higher things. So did God hear Hannah's cry? And if so, did he give an answer? And despite all of her pleadings, was her thinking truly in harmony with his purpose or not? And would the response of God be that further delay was necessary, or that he had another means of advancing his plan? Well, those questions, brothers and sisters,